Yeah, so let's talk about the devil. Interesting topic. So the devil is not this entity, it's not this malevolent being that's in opposition to God. That whole framework comes from mythology. We find it in many different traditions. Of course, worded differently. There's different names for the devil or the negative entity, and then God, or sometimes there's multiple gods in mythology, and so you're dealing with all these different characters. But it's mythology. So what happens is we tend to read these ancient writings, and in so many of these ancient writings, like they just naturally would write in allegory or metaphor or with parable, especially like in the Bible. The Bible is full of this. And then we come along here in the 21st century and we go back and we try to read and interpret these ancient scriptures, and we're trying to understand them through our own way of like how we read stuff today. And what I mean by that is typically in the West, in the 21st century, and it's been this way for centuries, not just in this particular century, but there tends to be this gravitation towards literalism, right? So going back and like reading all these ancient scriptures, predominantly through literalism, thinking that this is all literal, this is all historical, this character or this being was a literal historical person, so on and so forth. And I'm not saying that everything in the Bible or any kind of, ancient book is strictly myth. There are some characters, some people in these stories that I believe were historical people. But then what happens is the way the writings work in that time, in the, let's just say, first century, like if we're talking about the Bible, you have writings and stories about people that may have existed, that may be historical people. But the stories about them are mythological stories. They're parables. They're not meant, the stories are not meant to be understood literally or historically. And that's why they're stories. And again, like during those times, in the ancient times, that's how these greater, deeper spiritual truths were conveyed. It was through the myth, it was through the parable. Because literalism, yeah, it's hard to get that across and really into someone's soul. Because literalism has a lot to do with the analytical thinking mind, and like having to have these things that literally happened and facts and history, and it's all mental on the level of the mind. So it can be hard, and this is something I think we all know from experience. Like when we go and watch a movie, okay, and the movie is a fiction movie, or it's a book we read, it's a fiction story. It's like something about the story, something about it being fiction has a way of really speaking to us on a deeper level than what the mind can handle, right? So why is that? Well, I don't really know, but that's just the way it is. But the ancient people, they knew this, and that's why they used the different parables and myths to convey and illustrate what was actually going on in the world. That's why like nearly every tradition, every religion has a creation story or a creation myth. It's not meant to be taken literally, like what they're saying in the story, but they're using all these different symbols and archetypes to explain how they were perceiving the world, or the beginning of the world, or the end of the world, from their level of consciousness. And the way that was presented was through some kind of writing that contained myth. And that's why you've got to have deep reverence for myth. I love Joseph Campbell. I love Carl Jung, and studying their works and understanding how like the way they would study and explain these ancient myths, it was in a way where you like, okay, so let me say it like this. I grew up here, when I heard that word myth growing up, it was like, oh, myth means it's not true. It's just like a fairy tale, right? But it doesn't, so a myth doesn't mean that whatever the myth is, whatever the story is, it doesn't mean that it's not true. It just means that it's not literal. And so something can be true but not literal because it's what the myth is pointing to. The myth is pointing to something that is very much true. And it's so true that the finite, analytical, thinking mind can't comprehend it. It can only be understood and embraced and experienced through the heart space. And that's what a myth is really supposed to do. It's supposed to take you to that place where you directly experience whatever it is it's pointing to. And like I said earlier, these myths are full of archetypes because the stories are strategically set up to bring you into almost like this contemplative state where you start to go within. That's why I think it was Joseph Campbell, he said something like, all the gods, all the heavens, all the hells are within you. And when you get that on that deeper experiential level, it changes everything. And it changes how you read and understand these ancient scriptures. Because you start realizing that so many of these stories and myths are actually about you. And not just you, but like the human experience that we're all going through, that we're all experiencing. So then you start to understand it on that level, and you can read these texts, and all of a sudden they become practical, they become real, they become something that you can actually benefit from directly, you know? So, yeah, the devil. So let's talk about this, okay? So we've got this story of Jesus going into the wilderness, right? And this is part of the Jesus myth. I'm not saying that Jesus was not a historical person. I don't know, to be honest. I have no clue. Probably was, but I don't have all of this data to prove it or anything, so who knows? I mean, some people think, a lot of the scholars, Christian scholars, and even scholars who aren't Christian, they believe that Jesus was a historical person. But I don't believe that the stories that we read about in the canonical Gospels were all literal and historical events by any means. They're loaded with mythology. And, you know, during that time in the first century, that whole world was highly influenced by Greek and Roman mythology. And we find that all throughout the New Testament writings. Once you start to study Greek and Roman mythology and you see the connections and parallels, you can't not see it once you go back and read the New Testament. It's all over. So anyway, you've got Jesus, and this is one of the myths in the, here's the other thing. In the Jesus story, in that particular myth, of what happens in his life, the different things. And so what's actually happening is you have all these different ancient myths, like I said, from the Greek world, the Roman world, the Egyptian world, that were way before the time when the New Testament writings were written in the first century. And so you have these authors who are highly influenced by these different myths, and they start to kind of take bits and pieces from these different myths, and then they put their own little twist on it. So it's not like they're copy and pasting directly from these ancient myths that came before them, but they're taking the themes and the archetypes and the lessons to be learned, and they're putting all of that into their version of the story. And so this is what happens with Jesus, right? He goes into the wilderness and he encounters the devil, right? The devil, Satan, whatever you want to call it, appears to him. And, you know, I remember growing up reading this story. I would like see Jesus in the desert, and I would, you know, envision like I think it was a movie I saw actually, or some kind of show I saw where they played this out, and the devil was like this evil-looking creature, with some kind of black robe and like a, I don't know, he just looked really creepy. And he would approach Jesus at different times, 3 times as the story goes, with different kinds of temptations. And Jesus, like, understood what was going on. He understood exactly what the root of these temptations were, and he was able to transcend every one of them. And then he comes back after his time in the wilderness, after spending time with the devil, and starts his ministry. Jesus of Nazareth goes through that, walks out of it, starts his ministry, and becomes the Christ. The Christ is not a person. It's a title, and it means the anointed one. So we might get back to that later on. But so that's that story. Okay, you've got Jesus going into the desert or the wilderness, whatever it is, encountering the devil. There's 3 different temptations. He overcomes the temptations and basically, transcends the devil in the story and wins and walks out of there a champion. Right. So again, I've always understood this to be a literal historical event, right? Until I started reading some of the other ancient stories and stuff that's happened in other traditions. And what you find when you start to do this is that this is not, this myth, this whole notion of some kind of enlightened being going out into the wilderness, spending time with God or whatever in the wilderness, and then facing some kind of demon or negative entity. That whole story doesn't show up for the first time in the canonical Gospels. No, because you have Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. Siddhartha Gautama, which this was written well before, centuries before Jesus, centuries before the New Testament writings in the 1st century. You've got Siddhartha Gautama, who goes into the wilderness and he sits under the Bodhi tree and he's meditating, right? And guess what? He's in the wilderness, he's in solitude, and guess what approaches him? Just take a guess. Yeah, it's a negative entity. And they, in the Buddhist tradition, they wouldn't necessarily call this entity the devil, but it kind of was. It was like some kind of demon. Its name was Mara. And guess what? This entity, this demon, if you want to call it that, approaches Siddhartha Gautama and says, it says these things, and there's 3 temptations. There's literally 3 temptations, and they're very similar. They're not, remember, it's not going to be, in these different stories and myths, they're not all going to be exactly the same. But there's different similarities on different levels, and there is in this story. So of course, Siddhartha Gautama is meditating, faces it, embraces it, transcends it, walks out of there the Buddha. The Buddha means the enlightened one. Yeah, so, very, very similar stories, many parallels, and it's all pointing to something. So the question is, okay, what is it pointing to? If the devil is not some kind of literal being, just think about that for a second. I grew up believing that, but it's well, wait a second. If that's the case, if the devil is this character, this malevolent being who's in opposition to God, who's wandering the earth and messing with people and trying to get people to sin, okay, does that mean that would mean that this being has to be omnipresent? Because people say, oh, the devil's attacking me, he's attacking me, he's attacking all these other, how is that even working? I thought God was the only one that was omnipresent or able to be in all these different places at once. So you really have to do a lot of you have to have a lot of assumption, and you have to really get into your imagination and make up stuff in order to make this whole narrative of the devil being some kind of fallen angel who's against God, and his whole plan at this point is to try to cause people to sin and turn away from God. Like, the Bible isn't even really clear on that at all. We get many different, and by the way, I made a video on Satan and the different, the serpent in the garden, the devil, all of that, Lucifer. I talk about all that in a video. So if you haven't seen that, I'll put that in the description below. I don't want to spend too much time getting into the different versions of Satan or the devil, or the different interpretations from a biblical perspective, because I've already talked about that. What I'm talking more about in this video is moving past this belief, this idea that we're dealing with, that when we talk about the devil, we're dealing with a literal character who's roaming around trying to get you to sin and trying to tempt you and all of this. So the question we have to ask, going back to these different myths, when the devil comes up, is, okay, if these myths are somehow pointing to the human experience, then what does this character, what does this entity represent? That's the question. And if you really think about it, let's just take the story of Jesus in the wilderness. The devil, we could say, is, and this is the way I interpret it, this is the way I think Carl Jung interprets it, but the devil is the shadow, or the egoic self, so it's actually a part of you. It's not this entity outside of you. Remember, Joseph Campbell said, all the heavens, all the hells, all the gods, it's all within you. So when you understand that there's nothing outside of you, everything is within you, the kingdom of God is within you, Jesus said, then you understand where this is going. So if the devil is within you, what could this mean? What is the devil actually representing? And I just said it, it's the shadow, but what does that mean? Well, it's the parts of us that we have rejected. It's the parts of us that have become repressed or suppressed, and it's this negative energy that is now manifesting in these different forms of negative emotions. And we're calling them negative because that's just our judgment, that's our perception of them, and that's part of the issue. And what I mean by that is, when we're dealing with the shadow self, when we're dealing with this, we could call it darkness within us that we're refusing to embrace and face and deal with, what it will do, Jesus said in the Gospel of Thomas, I think this is saying 70, he says this, he says, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you don't bring forth what is within you, what you don't bring forth will destroy you. So everything's energy, right? Everything's energy, and energy is naturally flowing and moving. So when we repress that energy within us through some kind of self-judgment or anger or unforgiveness or bitterness or guilt or whatever it is, whatever we're holding on to, whatever we're repressing, that energy builds up. And like I said, it literally starts to manifest in these different ways in our lives. And this is why Carl Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So this is what we're actually dealing with here. This is a deeper subconscious issue or an unconscious issue. And the question is, what do we do about it? How do we actually embrace this? How do we transcend it? How do we move forward in this human experience? Well, the first thing is acknowledgement. You have to acknowledge that this darkness, that this shadow is within you. This is part of this earth school. This is part of the curriculum. We all have this. We all experience this to a degree. But the curriculum is learning integration, because what the egoic mind will want to do with any kind of like repressed emotions or whatever, or with the shadow in and of itself, is it will want to get rid of it. It will want to reject it and fight it and like, yeah, all that kind of stuff, because that's just how the ego is wired. But when you transcend the ego and you realize that, oh, this is just what the ego was designed to do, but this is not going to lead me to experience my inherent liberation, then you catch yourself out and you're like, okay, I see what that is. And then you move to that higher realm, to that higher consciousness, and you start to understand the importance of wholeness and integration. So you have these different parts of yourself that are running your life, as Carl Jung would say. These deep inner wounds and repressed energy. And the natural tendency, like I said, and this has been such a big part of my life until I started to understand what this is and how it works, but a big part of my life was running from my deepest fears, my biggest insecurities, all the guilt and shame, because I thought, again, that's just how we're programmed. But when you start to sit with those emotions that you've been running from, and you start to sit with those feelings, and you start to embrace and accept, and most importantly, like I said, before you can even get into any of this, this is the most important step in this process. There has to be acknowledgement that it's there and it is what it is. Then you can shift into the whole phase of embracing and accepting, which is totally opposite of what the ego is trying to do with these different parts of us. And here's the thing, the whole thing about parts of us, and like I'm saying that to try to like convey the shadow self, but in reality, like, we are not fragmented. There are no parts. That's just it's just an appearance. It's just it's how the dualistic mind is trying to understand the self. But when you step into reality, when you transcend the illusion of separation, which is what I'm trying to explain here in this process of integration and wholeness, through the light of your awareness, see, you bring the light of your awareness after you acknowledge into these parts of yourself that you've been rejecting. And the light is what makes the unconscious conscious. The light is what heals. The light is what restores. The light is what reveals and shows you that you've always been whole, you've always been complete, you've always been enough. And when you experience that and you know that on that deeper level, then that is when you transcend the devil, but you're including it. And in the inclusion of it, it's transforming into something that is helping you and benefiting you and your journey and the curriculum that your soul has chosen to undergo in this human incarnation. So you see the process there? It's transcending and including, and then there's transformation. So the devil, don't even think of it as, again, that's the mythological term and symbol or representation for it. But don't think of it as something that's like evil or bad. No, it's energy that's been repressed and forgotten about and judged and criticized, and there's just a lot of anger and stuff built around it, but it doesn't make it evil. And you realize this, you know this, when you start to bring the light of your awareness to these different aspects of you, and the light shows you that you've always been whole, because ultimately all of these different feelings of being not enough, the fear, the anxiety, the worry, the depression, the guilt, the shame, like all of this stuff, all of these different emotions that we're experiencing or maybe repressing, and this is causing the negative buildups, all of that stuff is connected or rooted to a much deeper subconscious belief that we were persuaded into, and the subconscious mind accepted it, and then it took those beliefs and it started to create this narrative, this story about who we think we are. And maybe a big part of this narrative contain elements of who we thought we were that we didn't really like, and that's why we were rejecting and trying to like push these parts of ourselves away and all this kind of stuff, because most of it was coming from, like I said, these lies. And the lies weren't necessarily like, I gotta say this correctly, the lies weren't creating like these parts of you that you were rejecting, because the lies were trying to get you to believe that there was something already wrong with these different parts of you. The lies were the very things that were trying to tell you or convince you that you were fragmented in the first place. You see what I'm saying? I'm trying to like explain this and convey it the best way possible, but I don't know if I'm doing it. So if you're confused with what I'm saying here, just like drop a comment and say, hey, I don't know what the hell you're saying. Can you try to explain it better? And then what I'll do is I'll go back and I'll read the comment, and maybe I can put it better when I'm writing it into words. But essentially what I'm trying to say is the subconscious programming is just this perception that we take on. And then we judge ourselves based upon that perception, based upon that programming. But the reality is, there's never been anything wrong with you. All of that is just like stuff the mind is coming up with, the dualistic mind. And think about it, like all of this stuff that we just like accept and believe, and we just go with what everyone else is saying, it's all perception. That's why, I forget who it was. Somebody was talking about it the other day. They said, nothing has inherent meaning. Everything is neutral, and then we give it the meaning. We give it the judgment. We say this is this is that, and then that's what creates these deeper subconscious beliefs, and then it gets buried into the unconscious mind, and then that's when we're controlled by these deep ingrained programmings, and we don't even realize it. But look, this is something that, this is real to me. This is real spiritual work. This is real spirituality where, like, okay, you understand that this is something that each and every human being has to go through and understand in order to experience the inherent liberation that they already are. And I want to say that correctly too. Like, liberation is not something you get, it's something that you are. Your beingness is inherently free. The process, the journey, if you want to call it that, is letting go and detaching from all of these different lies and concepts and ideas and beliefs that have been clouding our perception of who we really are. So when you move past the clouds, or let me say it like this, when you let the clouds dissolve, all that's there is the infinite, eternal sky. And it's perfect, it's whole, it's complete, and it's always been that way. But if you're looking at the sky, like right now, it's a beautiful day, it's a gorgeous day right now where I'm at, blue skies, not a cloud in sight. But if it was a cloudy day and I didn't know better, I could look up at the sky and I could say, yeah, there's something wrong with the sky. Look, it's fragmented. Look at all these different parts, and there's this and there's that, and you know, it's a gloomy day. The sky is full of darkness, right? But is that actually what it is? No. It's just my perception, because I can't see through the clouds. I can't see through what's blocking the truth, but the truth is always true. The truth is always there. It's always here now. It's eternal, outside of time. So yeah, all the gods all the heavens, all the hells are within you, as Joseph Campbell says. But I'm going to add to that list, all the devils are within you as well. And once you see that, it changes everything. And how, like, okay, like practically, when you start to do the inner work, how can you, like, maybe you're asking the question, like, well, I don't know what these repressed emotions are within me, and I don't know, like, what these parts of myself are that I've been rejecting. Like, I'm having a hard time, like, figuring that out. Well, here's a really good way to figure it out. The first one is ask yourself, and this is where, again, this is true spirituality. This is true inner work, shadow work. You've got to be honest. Honesty is everything. So be honest with yourself and ask yourself, okay, like, are there certain things that I find myself constantly judging or criticizing in other people? And whatever that is typically what you are refusing to face within yourself. So it's projection. That's like the telltale sign of where we need to spend time in meditation, embracing ourselves, loving ourselves, having self-compassion. Because, like, if you're constantly going around saying, so-and-so is selfish and they're selfish and look at them, like, look how selfish they are. That's projection. That means that is something you're dealing with. And maybe it's something that you're not aware of. It's part of the unconscious. But that, again, it shows you where you're attached, where you're stuck, and that guides you into the inner work. The other thing is, it's simply noticing how you feel when these different emotions arise, and then you notice how there's like this quick knee-jerk reaction to automatically judge yourself for feeling that way. It's another indicative sign of, this is the devil within me. This is, and by the way, like in the word Satan, Hasatan, in Hebrew means the adversary. So it's something that is going against the truth of who you are, right? And that's what I'm saying here. Like, it's understanding what it is and then doing what you need to do, which is accept, embrace, love, because that's what actually, like, that's what dissolves the cloud. So those are some of the main things to be aware of when you start this journey of shadow work, and you feel like, this is something that's going to really help me. It is. It's going to absolutely transform your life. And it's not like, I spent a couple of days or weeks or a month or a year doing shadow work, and I've transcended all my inner demons by including them and embracing them, and I've realized that all these different things that I was judging and labeling as something that was evil or negative, like, I've been able to actually transform those things, because again, they don't have inherent meaning, just the meaning I give to them. They're actually neutral, and now I'm able to transform all these inner wounds, because there's actually profound gifts in all these inner wounds and scars and all the stuff. And I'm realizing that, the fear was just something that was protecting me. And, like, all these emotions were, like, they're neutral, but we judge them, and that's why we keep attracting them. That's part of that energy we could call it with, like, the inner demons or the devil within you. Like, as long as you keep judging it, you keep attracting different situations and circumstances in your life, in your external world, that reflect whatever it is that is repressed within you. It reflects that out there. So, So that's what I was saying, but I think that's it. I think I think that's all I wanted to say. I probably forgot some stuff, but like I said, if you have any questions about anything, any thoughts, comments, if you feel like I didn't explain something good enough, or you need me to be more clear about what I'm saying and what I'm not saying, just drop a comment. I'll find it. I'll respond to it. And that's just typically how I am. I think I'm more of a writer. That's how I express my thoughts in the best way that I know how. Speaking, sometimes it comes across well. Other times I'm all over the place, or I don't convey it well. So yeah, but the devil is not an entity, it's not a being. It's the shadow. It's within you. And the good news, the gospel, is that by accepting it, embracing it, and shining the light of your awareness straight through it, within it, it will start to dissolve, or it will be transformed, and you'll see that there is this inherent wholeness to your being. And that's what this human game is all about. It's about realizing that and seeing that and experiencing it and living from that truth, from that reality through your human incarnation. Transcend and include. That's what spiritual evolution is all about. So I think that's it. All right, I'll see you next time.